Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for yet another edition of IRENA Insights webinar series. My name is Martina Lyons. I am from the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn. If you are joining us for the first time, let me introduce you to IRENA and to our webinar series. We are an intergovernmental organization. We have currently 163 member countries and another 21 countries in their accession process. We support countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future and serve as the principal platform for international cooperation, a center of excellence, and a repository of policy, technology, resource, and financial knowledge on renewable energy. Since our analytical work and our engagement with our members generates a lot of valuable insights, we are constantly looking for more ways to share those insights with you. And that is why we launched our fortnightly IRENA webinar series in January 2020, so way before the pandemic drove the proliferation of online events. So every other week, presenters from one of IRENA's team, either alone or together with invited guests, share with you key findings from their latest work, offer you insights into opportunities, trends, best practices, but also innovative solutions, how to address various challenges. We aim to keep these webinars short. They last approximately 30 minutes, so we cannot cover everything, but we do hope to give you enough to decide whether to delve deeper into the topic, and we signpost in our presentations further sources of more in-depth information to help you to do that. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is the second part of a two-part series on hydrogen. After hearing 2 weeks ago on hydrogen, green hydrogen policies, today's focus will be on hydrogen cost production, green hydrogen cost production. Our speakers today are Mr. Emanuele Taibi, who is IRENA's expert on power sector transformation strategies, and Mr. Harry Blanco, who is IRENA experts on power to X and hydrogen particularly. Their presentation will last approximately 20 minutes to allow another 10 minutes for your questions. Emanuele and Harry will share with you key takeaways from a recent IRENA report, Green Hydrogen Cost Reduction. Particularly, they will walk us through the different strategies that will allow achieving a low cost for the electrolyzer and will make green hydrogen competitive with other low carbon pathways. But before I hand over the microphone to Emanuele and Harry, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. So next slide, please. Today's webinar is recorded and will be available together with the presentation slides on IRENA webinar website under past webinars. The previous webinar recordings and slides are already there, and we will share also the link with you to this website in our follow-up email. All of you are currently muted and you will remain so throughout the webinar. Next slide, please. We would love to hear from you during today's presentation. So if you have any questions to Emanuele and Harry, please send it to us through the question feature that you can find on the webinar panel. We will be monitoring questions throughout the session and select some to be answered by Emanuele and Harry. But due to time constraints, we apologize in advance if your question is not being answered. To be able to reflect on the delivery of our webinar and ways to improve it, and also what else we should cover in our future editions, we would appreciate your feedback. So at the end of the webinar, and then again in the follow-up email, we will share with you a very short satisfactory survey, which we invite you to complete. We're monitoring your comments and we work on selecting topics of your interest and trying to shift times of webinars to accommodate various time zones. And last but not least, if you experience any technical difficulties, please try to reconnect by dialing in via phone. You can get the number by clicking on the phone option locating on the webinar panel. Otherwise, please visit support services on the GoToWebinar website. And now, without any further ado, let me kick things off by welcoming Emanuele and Harry. Guys, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martina, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. So next slide, please. As a matter of introduction, this is really not the first time we've been talking in this series about hydrogen, and not the first report as IRENA that we produce on this topic. So this is somehow our fourth hydrogen dedicated report, and this is without counting those that relate to hydrogen quite significantly that we've been presenting in other occasions. Last summer, we presented the first two reports in a similar setting in the IRENA webinar series. And last week, you heard from our colleague Emanuele Bianco about the third report in the series on policies. So today's focus is on green hydrogen and how to reduce its cost. A couple of words as a matter of introduction there. Hydrogen today is mostly what we call gray, and gray means it's produced from fossil fuels without carbon capture and storage. And the objective of this is not really the energy transition, but is to be an input for specific processes, most notably refineries and fertilizer production. What is different is that we are looking now at hydrogen as a key pillar for a decarbonization strategy. As you heard, many countries have been announcing net zero targets by 2050, 2060, and hydrogen is a key pillar to get there. As IRENA, we also released last week our first net zero by 2050 scenario, and I will say a few words about that in the next few slides. But essentially, the context is different, and green hydrogen is relatively new. Hydrogen is not, but it's not for energy transition. So what we're trying to do here is to connect the excellent developments in terms of renewable electricity, take water, produce hydrogen without emissions, both on the production and on the consumption side. And we will try to explore how to reduce the cost by reducing the cost of the key component to be coupled with renewable electricity, which is the electrolyzer. Next slide, please. An important element of this process for IRENA as an intergovernmental organization is its convening power to bring together governments to discuss key challenges and best practices for accelerating hydrogen deployment. We started with a ministerial roundtable last year, January, where ministers and CEOs got together to discuss these matters and asked IRENA to continue this public-private dialogue, which led to the establishment of the IRENA Collaborative Framework on Green Hydrogen in June last year. We already hosted two plenary virtual meetings, one working group specific meeting on certification last year, and our next meeting will be towards the end of April. So far, we've been engaging with 65 countries, the Hydrogen Council and the IPHE, and we're having a significant collaboration in this space with the World Economic Forum. And currently, this collaborative framework is co-facilitated by the European Commission and Morocco. Next slide, please. So I mentioned last week we released our first global net zero scenario by 2050. And I just wanted to look at one specific element in these two charts, which is on the right-hand side, the light green, which is hydrogen. So as you can see, there is a significant role to play for hydrogen in the decarbonization scenarios. And compared to previous scenarios, which were looking at net zero, or let's say 2 degrees in 2060 or 2070, bringing the target to 2050 means a significant increase in the need for green hydrogen in decarbonization scenarios, as well as blue hydrogen. As you can see, the darker part of the bar, so 1/3 of that is blue hydrogen. Nonetheless, the main player of this decarbonization is clearly direct electrification, with more than 50%, and direct electrification with renewables, most importantly. Next slide, please. And that's my last slide before I hand it over to Eric. This slide is a bit trying to summarize different aspects that we looked at in this report and translate it into one simple message for policymakers. And this simple message is divided in two parts. One is electricity. Renewable electricity is already very competitive in many countries today in terms of cost. And we really need to look at the cheapest renewable energy projects and locations if we want to produce competitive green hydrogen. As you can see, the yellow-orange area never gets into the competitiveness space, although it's based on a relatively good electricity price, I would say $65 a megawatt hour, which is achievable with renewables everywhere in the world. While in the best location today, we can go below $20 a megawatt hour. And this is why it is so interesting today. And this is why green hydrogen competitiveness is feasible, because we can see these prices today, and moving to 2050, we can expect them to further decrease. And you see the green range, it's already today very close to competitiveness with $20 a megawatt hour. So what is next? To reduce the cost of electrolyzers. How to do that? Significantly scaling it up in terms of manufacturing capacity, infrastructure, supply chains, etc. And I will leave this to Harry to explain. What is important to see there is that the more we deploy electrolyzers, the more the cost decreases. And this means we're getting to the very low end of the fossil fuel range, if not even cheaper. When this is going to happen will depend on the speed of deployment for electrolyzers, as well as further reduction in electricity costs from renewables. And with this, I hand it over to Harry to give you more information on how to get there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emanuele, for setting the scene. In the next slide, we will see basically the 4 strategies that we analyze for achieving that cost reduction. So the first one is innovation. That's focused on changing the design of the electrolyzer itself, specifically the stack. The stack is the core part of the electrolyzer. Scaling up manufacturing, which is economies of scale and decreasing the cost contribution of the stack. Scaling up the modules, which is also economies of scale, but by making the electrolyzer larger and decreasing the cost of the so-called balance of plant. I will explain that in the coming slides. And learning by doing, which is basically through standardizing the design, having modularization. All of these strategies achieve a cost reduction of, we estimate, 40% in the short term and up to 80% in the long term. So we'll go in the next couple of slides is basically through each of these strategies. But before that, in the next slide, we see basically there are the principle of electrolyzers is the same for all of this, but there are 4 key technologies that do have differences among themselves. So what we see here is, again, the 4 electrolyzer technologies. On the left, alkaline and proton exchange membrane are the ones that are already at commercial scale, that are ready to scale up, while the 2 on the right, anion exchange membrane and solid oxide, are at a lower technological level development. And those 2 on the right are on the kilowatt scale, while the ones on the left are already in the megawatt scale, with the largest facility in the 20 megawatt scale. And for you to have a sense of order of magnitude that we're talking about here, alkaline and proton exchange membrane, the global capacity is around 0.2 gigawatts today. And that has to scale up to, looking at 2050, in the order of 4,900, 5,000 gigawatts. So it's a huge task that is ahead. One more remark on this slide is that the ones on the right, even though the anion exchange membrane and solid oxide, even though they have a lower technological level of development, solid oxide has a promise of higher efficiency, and anion exchange membrane has a promise of decreasing the cost by mass manufacturing. If we go to the next slide, we will go already to the first strategy for cost reduction, which is innovation. What you have to have in mind here is basically changing the design of the stack, which is the core part of the electrolyzer, and then there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off between efficiency, cost, and lifetime, durability. So as you change the design, you will improve in one of these dimensions, but you will have a detrimental effect on the other ones. And on the left, I have a couple of examples. So for example, the second one, membrane thickness. You want the membrane between the electrodes. So the thinner the membrane is, the higher the efficiency is. So that's a good side. But the downside is that thinner membrane could also lead, for example, to lower, shorter lifetime, lower durability. So in all of this, as you change the design of the stack, there's a trade-off to have between these parameters. That's the key idea from this slide. In the next slide, we see the other aspect of innovation, which is materials. If we go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so here we see the same 4 technologies of electrolyzer on the top, and some of them use critical materials. So for example, alkaline uses platinum and cobalt. Those could limit the scale up of this technology, but today there are already some manufacturers that have designs free from those critical materials. This point is a bit more critical for proton exchange membrane, where the two materials used are platinum and iridium. Iridium, especially if the entire global capacity of iridium would be used for proton exchange membrane production, this would support 3 to 7.5 gigawatts per year of capacity. So this could constrain the scaling up of the electrolyzer. And this is precisely where innovation is critical to reduce. There are different strategies that we see on the right on the table. You could improve, for example, current density, that is a proxy for how much the electrolyzer produces. You could decrease the loading of those materials, recycling, increasing the yield, among others. But basically, innovation is key to reduce the content of these materials and be able to unlock that larger manufacturing capacity. So that's critical for PM, but it's already in the research agenda. For solid oxide, there are a couple of critical materials that could limit the scale up, the ones that we see on top. And another constraint is that many of these critical materials have limited countries where they come from. So for example, platinum and iridium, they come 70 to 85% of that comes from South Africa only. And for the ones in solid oxide, they come mostly from China. So that's another key area of innovation. In the next slide, we see the second strategy of cost reduction. In the next slide, please, which is the scaling up of manufacturing capacity. What we see on the graph on the right, on the left, is how the cost decreases with a larger capacity for the manufacturing plant. And we see the cost components. In the x-axis is the capacity of the plant in megawatts per year, and we see that around 1 gigawatt per year, so in the Dowson, most of the economies of scale are achieved. And we can also see that most of the economies of scales are in the stack part. So this strategy is mainly for reducing the cost contribution of the stack, where the core of the electrolyzer, the electrolysis happens. And this is in theory, but also in practice. We see on the right, some of the largest manufacturers have already announced some targets for the short term, targeting that capacity. So ThyssenKrupp is already at the 1 gigawatt per year scale. Nel announced recently, 2 months ago, the expansion to 2 gigawatts per year with a 75% cost reduction that they're targeting. And ITM also with their plant in UK, going for a similar scale in the short term and the next 3 to 4 years. So key idea from this slide is mainly for stack and economies of scale during manufacturing. In the third strategy is economies of scale during by scaling up the module size. So what we see here is the dots represent the net investment and the bars represent the cost contribution. Increasing the module size from 1 to 100 megawatts could already decrease the cost by around 2/3. And this strategy is mainly targeted for the so-called balance of plant, which is things like the power electronics, hydrogen compression, and water treatment, for example. But the cost is not the only parameter determining the size. So for example, 100 megawatts wouldn't be suitable for applications in transport or residential. So cost is only one dimension, one parameter to consider in the module size. In the next slide, we see the final cost strategy, the strategy for cost reduction, which is learning by doing. This means building upon optimizing the supply chain, having a standardized design, and having a modular design that can reduce, for example, the installation costs and assembly on site. There are different estimates for learning rates. Learning rates is the cost decrease for doubling the capacity, the global capacity, and there are different estimates for electrolyzers and fuel cells. Fuel cells are the same fundamental design and operation. It's an electrochemical process. So learning rates from fuel cells can also be used, and the range is somewhere between 8 and 18%. That 8 to 18% represents, again, the cost decrease for every doubling of the capacity. So what we see here, it's basically the curve that cost decrease with increasing capacity, having in mind today, again, there are 0.2 gigawatts of water electrolysis, and there are 20 gigawatts of electrolysis for chlor-alkali that has a very similar design. So already increasing the capacity to somewhere in the 300 gigawatts could decrease the cost to somewhere in the range of $300 to $400 per kilowatt, with the uncertainty in the learning rate. So these are the 4 key strategies for cost reduction, and the impact of this we see on the next slide. So where we are today, around $5 per kilogram, this has a range of uncertainty, as Emanuela highlighted in the first few slides, depending on the electricity price and the specific region that we take. But if we take that 5 as a starting point, the cost reduction in the electrolyzer through the 4 strategies that I just showed could lead to an 80% reduction in that electrolyzer cost, and already decrease the green hydrogen cost by around $2 per kilogram, with a further reduction, as Emanuela highlighted, to the level of around $20 per megawatt hour, could already reduce by another $1.2, $1.3 per kilogram, and bring the green hydrogen cost below that $2 per kilogram mark. Further improvements in efficiency, full load hours, and the ones that you see on the screen, in the long term, the green hydrogen cost could reach that $1 per kilogram level. So that's just to put in perspective these strategies that I showed in terms of electrolyzer costs, what's the impact that they can have in green hydrogen costs. And with that, in the next slide, we just see the couple of reports that we have produced on hydrogen, and for sure more work will come this year. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Harry, and thank you, Emanuela, for your very insightful presentation. A lot of interesting insights unpacked there. We have received several questions from the audience, including some from the previous webinar. So let me start with this one, which will be for Harry. Electrolyzers use a lot of water as input. What is the environmental impact and cost of this water use? Wouldn't water scarcity be a constraint for the places that can produce green hydrogen? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, so electrolyzers use around 9 kilograms of water per kilogram of output, with some water treatment that could go to a ratio of 20 kilograms of water per kilogram of hydrogen. But to put that in perspective, the gray hydrogen route uses a similar amount of water, around 11 to 12 kilograms. But in general, even if it is in a water stress region, desalination is an option. And desalination, even though it has a relatively high water cost, the cost contribution to the hydrogen cost is very small, in the order of $0.02 per kilogram for that water treatment, including through water desalination. So in terms of cost, it's a small cost contribution, and in terms of energy, is also less than 1% of the total electricity consumption. Yeah, so both in cost and energy is relatively small.
Wonderful, thank you. There is a question from Emanuele. Is it realistic to assume that 30 years from now, the electrolyzer's capacity will grow by a factor of almost 25,000 times? Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Well, what we try to say is that electrolyzer technology in general is not new. It's more than 100 years old, and this was initially not for energy or for energy transition purposes, but more for producing other feedstocks, like could be the case of ammonia for fertilizers. So it's not new, but what we need to do is to scale up significantly and for energy purposes. So 25,000 could be even millions of times if you start from zero. So we are close to zero today and ramping up very quickly from kilowatts to megawatts to gigawatts. So Harry already illustrated that we are getting into the gigawatts manufacturing capacity per year per main manufacturer. And this is very much in line with what we need to achieve. But of course, 25,000 times or 1,000,000 times increase starting from where we are today, it's a very daunting challenge in terms of the speed that we need. So we need manufacturing at scale, we need infrastructure, we need significant renewable capacity to power these machines, because the end goal you saw on the chart from Erib, it's about 5 terawatts by 2050 in our scenario just released last week, and we are at 200 megawatts, so we need to get up to speed very quickly.
Thank you, Emanuele. For Harry, if you can elaborate a little bit by technology, when do you think different electrolyzers may be available?
Yeah, so as I highlighted in one of the slides, 2 are already available. Alkaline and PM are already commercial today and ready to scale up, and the other 2 are in the kilowatt scale, and yeah, they are at least 5 to 10 years behind in terms of compared to the other 2. So they're still very small scale, lab scale, and they need a few more years before reaching that commercial scale.
Thank you. Another one is probably better for Emanuele. There are many electrolyzers technology, and their evolution may reduce the cost of hydrogen, but the real driver seems to be the cost of electricity. If you can provide your point of view on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. And indeed, I think this is the key point. So renewable electricity at scale and low cost is a necessary condition for competitive green hydrogen. No matter how cheap is the electrolyzer, if the electricity doesn't go below a certain threshold, we will not have competitive green hydrogen. And the purpose of the slide with the curves and the area shows the uncertainty related to the electrolyzer vis-a-vis the uncertainty related to electricity costs. So we do need cheap renewable electricity and electrolyzers. It's not an either or challenge. And so we are gonna probably see this starting in very large, decentralized, low-cost locations, or very close to the demand, which is probably what is already happening today, is starting to have production very close to the demand. But in principle, yes, electricity from renewables and very cheap is good.
Thank you very much. Maybe this one is better for Harry, but please feel free to add to each other. When do you think it would be available, the AM technology availability to scale up? And what about the alkaline high pressure and high temperatures? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Martina. Yeah, I think the AEM I already addressed before, so it's in the kilowatt scale, and maybe 5 to 10 years from now we'll reach that megawatt and commercial scale. For the high pressure alkaline, so today some designs are at atmospheric pressure. That decreases the cost of the electrolyzer itself, but increases the cost of the downstream compression. But there are already designs of pressurized alkaline. So that one is also available today, and the high temperature, that's solid oxide technology, which is also in the kilowatt scale today, and again 5 to 10 years behind the other 2.
Thank you. There is a question about the average lifetimes for electrolyzers. If you can elaborate on this a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, lifetime is somewhere, depending on the type of electrolyzer, 50 to 80,000 operating hours, but for solid oxide and anion exchange membrane have much lower lifetimes today. Yeah, and there, as the with more hours of operation, the parameter that decreases is efficiency. So there will be a decrease in efficiency over the lifetime of degradation. So that's the parameter to measure the lifetime. But in terms of numbers, is that 50 to 80,000 and much lower for AEM and solid oxide.
Thank you. Another one, where do you expect the first electrolyzers to be installed in the near term? I don't know, maybe Emanuele or Harry. Sorry.
Well, the short answer is they're already installed, so there are not many, but definitely we're seeing projects coming up. And as we were saying before, at the moment they're mostly coming very close to the demand. That would save significant effort in terms of logistics, while we scale up the infrastructure. So the key point there is that, yes, there are locations around the world with extremely abundant and cheap renewables that might feed a global market, but this global market has to be developed. And for that, we need infrastructure, we need standards, we need certification to know how do we get from A to B with low environmental impact and with low cost and limiting the efficiency losses. And this is in the process, while at the moment what is happening is to go close to large sources of demand, like could be industrial facilities that consume hydrogen today and replace gray hydrogen with green hydrogen through electrolysis systems. We see some of this in Europe. I think the largest at the moment is in Canada, and more coming in different countries around the world.
Thank you. And we are running out of time, so I will just ask one more question. This one is about the cost of transport of hydrogen. How does it affect the competitiveness? If you can also elaborate on this. Thank you very much. Harry, sorry.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, thanks for the question. So yeah, cost of transport, it depends on the form. So for low volumes, it can be distribution pipelines, trucks, compressed hydrogen or liquid hydrogen. And for the long distance, it can be pipelines or ships, for example, for large volume, long distances. And the range is very wide, because for small volumes, yeah, it doesn't have economies of scale. So it could, if it's, for example, by trucks, it could be in the order of $2, $3, $4 per kilogram. But once you reach the large volumes and economies of scale, so for example, for pipelines, and even if you convert, for example, a gas pipeline to hydrogen, it could be in the order of $0.1, $0.2 per kilogram. And the thing for ships is the conversion step. So the transport cost might be low. As an example, the liquid hydrogen, ammonia, for example, the ammonia transport in a ship, the cost contribution might be less than $0.5 per kilogram. But the problem is the conversion to ammonia and the cracking of the ammonia if you want pure hydrogen. So in general, it depends on volume and distance, and there are different options for doing it.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so let me thank our speakers, Mr. Emanuele Taibi and Mr. Harry Blanco, for sharing with us their work and insights into hydrogen and hydrogen cost reduction strategies. And equally, thanks to all of you for joining us and for your very good questions. Next slide, please. Actually, two. We want to leave you with two final announcements. So the first one, as mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, we would like to invite you to complete a very short satisfactory survey, which will appear at the end of the webinar. And the link will be shared with you also in the follow-up email. We are monitoring all the comments, and we are going to selecting topics of your interest. So thank you in advance for completing the survey, which had been very helpful to us. And last but not least, we would like to invite you to our next edition of this webinar series. So we will have on 13th of April, we will present you with key insights from IRENA annual report, World Energy Transition Outlook, which was published last year during the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue, and which Emanuele touched upon during his presentation. And as said by Emanuele, this edition for the first time focuses on the 1.5 degree compatible scenario and sees emissions declining rapidly and reaching net zero by 2050. So our speaker in a few weeks, on 13th of April, we present you with the projections and discuss with you the challenges and also opportunities to massively accelerate the pace in many areas in the upcoming years. So the registration will be open within 2 days, and we will share with you the link in our follow-up email. So this is all from us for today. Once again, thank you, Emanuele, and thank you, Harry, for sharing with us your insights. And thank you all for joining us, and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you, Martina, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.